Now, Mbali, the IEC held its briefing this afternoon. It's still not clear which direction the Commission will take in approaching the relevant court. It certainly looks like we are none the wiser.
That's right, Bongi. Of course, so we saw the IEC this afternoon holding that press briefing and following that report from Justice Moseneke earlier this week. And you are quite right, Bongi. You have even tried to ask the IEC yourself as to whether which court it will approach. Now, we do know that they will either go to the Electoral Court or to the Constitutional Court. And of course, this is something that a number of South Africans will be watching closely. But to make sense of this, Bongi, and just to get an understanding of how this process will unfold, of course, we are joined by constitutional law expert Rebecca Sibanda, and she joins us via Zoom now. Rebecca, we have now seen from the IEC, and they have said that they will, of course, petition a competent court, and that court is either the Electoral Court or the Constitutional Court. When you look into this issue, why is it that the IEC won't specifically say which court it will approach? Because one would say that this is a constitutional matter, so the Constitutional Court would be the right court to approach.
Good evening, and thank you for having me, Mbali. I think the concern here is that the Electoral Court was established to address all matters related to elections in the country. So it is the court that normally would be the forum that you approach when there's a constitutional issue. And we have seen in the few months in May and in June the Electoral Court being approached for the deferment of other elections. Last year it was approached for the deferment of by-elections. So it is the primary forum for all election-related issues. However, the issues we are faced with now are bigger than just merely elections. We have constitutional issues that have also been raised, such as the right to health, the right to life, the right to vote, which is enshrined in the Constitution. The obligations that the IEC has are also enumerated in the Constitution. We have heard people raising the possibility of a constitutional amendment. That's also a constitutional issue. And finally, the fact that if we don't hold these elections this year, there are municipal councils across the country whose term will end, effectively removing their authority to make decisions. So should they continue to stay in their offices, whatever decisions they take will then be invalid and unlawful. In the middle of a pandemic, you can imagine the anarchy that will follow. So there is a balance now of options, balance of issues that have to be considered before the Commission can elect the appropriate forum to approach.
We've also seen this report coming out from Justice Moseneke just a bit earlier on in the week. And of course, the IEC says that they have adopted, this decision. And of course, that report from Moseneke, when you look at these recommendations, and we've also even asked a number of law experts, they are saying that it is not binding. What does this mean for the IEC and the decision it has taken?
The IEC, again, is a constitutional body. It has a wealth of powers. It's empowered by the highest law in the land. So it has the power to institute or look for these kind of commissions and their recommendations, but it retains the prerogative to decide what course of action to take. So the IEC can very well decide that tomorrow it will announce that it is going to go ahead with the elections, or we will see a court action, an urgent application to find a path forward, whether the Constitutional Court or the Electoral Court will decide that a deferment is the appropriate path, or that the elections must go ahead. And I think we must bear in mind that there's a lot of implications that accompany the deferment as well as the go-ahead of the elections, both health-wise in terms of the pandemic, but also, like I've indicated, constitutional implications, financial implications on both sides of the coin.
And what is the possibility for any court to grant a delay in a national election? I mean, we've never seen this before, especially in our country.
I want to be brave and bold and say we're living in uncertain times. We have never been presented with a situation quite like this. And the court itself, should it be approached, will have to make a very complicated decision, because it's between a rock and a hard place, in that if the court decides to defer the elections, that's the first time we'll ever see it. But also the implications, the domino effect is that, constitutional obligations will not be met. there might be an unconstitutional, if the issue particularly of the municipal council is not addressed before the court, you're going to have an unconstitutionally present bunch of municipal councils and public officials who are making decisions they no longer have the authority to make. But also, if the court, whichever forum is approached, decides that the elections must go ahead, then there's a very high likelihood that political parties, other organizations from civil society will approach the courts after the fact and say that these elections were unfair and not free. So you see that both sides of the coin carry quite hefty implications, negative ones, that in the end, I think we must wait and see what the courts decide should the IEC decide to go that route. And also, like, we must not forget that we are living in a pandemic, and the health implications, considering our low vaccine rate, will likely have quite a number of super spreader events across the country on election day. We also have to consider the staff and the volunteers who participate in election day, that they probably haven't been vaccinated either. So the courts, whichever forum will have to handle this case, is in between a rock and a hard place.
And Rebecca, you've also touched on this issue, saying that what if the courts actually reject this application and say that, these elections need to go ahead because there is a constitutional mandate to hold these elections. This will also, dealing with political parties, they have said on numerous occasions that, we cannot go to elections. We have not campaigned. And should the courts reject this and say, well, we need to go to elections, then what happens then?
I think we have to remember that elections are not just about election day. Political parties have a constitutionally protected right to campaign. The build-up before elections is just as much as important as election day for political parties, as well as the electorate. We, as the electorate, have the right to, have access to the relevant information before we go to the voting booths. And I think there's a few arguments that have been raised. I think the most important one is that smaller parties and those parties whose electorate is part of the indigent and the poorer communities will be disadvantaged by a shift or a move towards social media as the main or primary campaign tool. Also, parties may then flout, alert level 4 regulations and go out campaigning into communities, again, putting lives at risk. The traditional rally structure or the rally model for campaigns is still quite a big one for many political parties. Not all members of the electorate are, computer literate. Not all of them are proficient with social media, etc. Not all of them have access to televisions. So we have to keep in mind the right of political parties to campaign effectively. And I think at the end of the day, it's very unlikely that COVID is going to leave us in the next year or two. So whenever these elections are held, be it in October this year or later on next year, it's not going to be a perfect election. And I think if we look in the past as well, we've seen that there have been imperfections in all elections that have been held. We just have to make a decision and find some certainty for the way forward.
All right. Thank you very much. Of course, that is Rebecca Sibanda. She is a constitutional law expert. They're just providing a bit of insight in terms of the decisions of the IEC. I must say that, Bongi, it is an unprecedented time, especially in our country, when dealing with this matter. The next few months will be quite crucial because the IEC has at least 3 more months left until we reach that date, October 27, where we are expected to have those elections. And it's quite tricky. We don't know whether they will be taking place this year. It is, of course, up to the courts to decide whether those elections will go ahead later this year. And that's all we have for you from today in politics.